Samuel Reynolds, a former skeptic, had a life-changing visit to an astrologer and has since spent over 30 years studying astrology. Now Sam consults and teaches astrology full-time. He serves as president of the newly established International Coalition of Astrology Educators and was the co-recipient of the International Society for Astrological Researchers 2022 Community Service Award. He's a former board member of ESAR and former board president for the International Academy of Astrology, and you can find his website at unlockastrology.com. Sam is also on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, and Twitter, also Facebook. And Sam, you already have a brilliant YouTube channel, so I recommend checking that one out as well. Okay, that's enough from me, Sam. I'm excited to pass on the baton to you, and I'm excited for this topic today.
All right. Thank you, Callum. Thank you, everyone. I asked Callum before coming on, like if it's normal to have so many registrants, and he said that, yeah, it is to have so many of you coming from all around the world. And I'm very honored and very grateful that you are here with me and that you're interested in this topic. We have a lot to cover. So today is Uranus and Gemini crossing lines and lanes. And you'll see very clearly and soon why I designate it that way. Let's start with Uranus's meaning. I'll go into that and then contrast that to Uranus and Taurus because we're just finishing up with Uranus and Taurus. Then we'll go into Uranus and Gemini, match with the Great Conjunction and talk about what that might mean. And then look at Uranus in Gemini historically, both from the 19th and 20th centuries, and then going through Uranus and Gemini with the Decans. This is much more forward thinking, going 10 degrees at a time, which is going to take us through from the beginning all the way to the end, at least 7 years from now. Then perhaps the thing, either if you've been following me for a while or you've seen me in other places like at ESAR, I'm going to talk about something that I haven't seen elsewhere. How Uranus is going to affect not each generation, but how it does relate to at least 3 generations. If there's time, or another way we can look at it is going to be looking at it in terms of previous generations, but I'm going to focus on those who were born with Uranus in Scorpio, Sagittarius, and in Capricorn. So that is one thing that I will also do. Okay, and then Uranus, I'll touch a little bit about what to expect when Uranus is transiting and some things that are happening over the next 2 years. How to kind of relate to Uranus in your personal chart and beyond. And then there's a summary. So yes, all of that in 75 minutes will happen. Okay, let's move forward. Let's talk about what Uranus signifies. What is the thing to understand about Uranus? I will say Uranus is the fire bringer, even though, and I think about fire bringer specifically related to the myth of the mythical Prometheus, who was a Titan who disobeyed Zeus's command in terms of supporting human beings when he was trying to, one of those times when Zeus was determined to kill and destroy his, the creations, his creation. Well, actually, Prometheus is said to have created human beings. And Prometheus looked out for human beings and, according to myth, brought fire. It cost him. It cost him great pain, but he was determined to do that. And you're like, well, why are you talking about Prometheus when we should be talking about Uranus? Well, there is, if you've read or you're familiar with the author Richard Tarnas in his book Cosmos and Psyche, one of the things he does say is that maybe Uranus has been misnamed. And, because Uranus, the sky god, who kind of, we could say gave birth to Saturn, actually is less a disruptor and kind of a challenger and probably more of a tyrant and pain in the butt. But Prometheus, the idea of Uranus really does tie in more with this idea of kind of more the rebel, kind of going against the grain. And so we could say with Uranus that he is related to surprises, disruptions, and eruptions. What's Uranian is more related to the cutting edge of culture, the avant-garde, the outre, and the idea of individuality, that divine spark or genius that we have. And there are many classical designations for genius, but we could say the more modern one relates to Uranus. The other thing to recognize about Uranus is that it does take Uranus 83 to 84 years to complete its year or journey through all 12 signs of the zodiac. So let's go back. Even though we're finishing up with, and I think we could say that more to May 20, well, yeah. And you might say, well, why are you saying April 2026 for Uranus into Taurus? That's when he has finished completely. And he is more steadfast doesn't go back into Taurus and he stays into Gemini. So that's why I have that longer designation. I'm going to be talking about this related to generations. And one of the things to keep in mind related to generations and why I'm talking about it this particular way is that Uranus in Taurus, again, jumping a little ahead, is the activator for the Uranus in Sagittarius crowd, or we could say generation, those who were born with Uranus in Sagittarius. But one of the things that has cropped up as Uranus has moved into Taurus is the redrawing of global divisions, perhaps the reignition of the Cold War. Now, you might say, well, what about that phrasing? Why are you saying it that way? Well, one thing to know in terms of how I'm going to talk about Uranus a little later is I've been talking about this at least since 2003. With looking at Uranus related to activation points for various generations. And so I anticipated some measure of this move or acceleration of the former Soviet Union, or now what we just call Russia, is kind of reigniting some dimension of the Cold War, which now we can draw in China. And so that's one particular thing that has surfaced since Uranus has been in Taurus. A global concern about shrinking finances and resources. That certainly has proven true. New visions of currencies, including the acceleration and growth of what we call cryptocurrencies. And now we're dealing with a fight to preserve the global sense of connection that we've achieved. So we've gotten more of a critique and even, I guess, an actual push against globalism, especially from the United States, but this is seeming to become a worldwide phenomenon. So these are some of the things that have happened, not all of the things that have happened while Uranus has been transiting through Taurus. Another designation, another way in which I've described Uranus in Taurus is kind of shifting tectonic plates. There's a lot that's happening beneath the surface. We could say the Earth is undergoing a profound reconfiguration of who's in power and even its very self, meaning in terms of, what's happening with the Earth, climate change, and these particular things. And so this seems to reflect the true or be true to the slow nature of Taurus. These changes are significant, but not as perceptible if we're not paying attention. These are going to be much more subtle changes and important for us to acknowledge and understand each of the missions of our generation, which is what I'm going to go more into. Now you're like, well, where did you get all this? How do you know? Well, a couple things before I start talking about Uranus and Gemini. One particular thing, since I've been cultivating some of these ideas, as I mentioned to you, for almost 22 years now, is that Uranus gives us a profound opportunity to look back on time, because it goes through a cycle of 83, 84 years. So it covers more in terms of, succinctly within a century. And so some of what you just saw in this previous slide, I gathered from looking at the last time Uranus was in Taurus, when we were dealing with the Allied and Axis forces of World War II, or just before World War II. So I'm going to touch on that. And we could see that Germany, for instance, was emerging out of the global depression, but more so its more acute depression from World War I. and really trying to figure out its own sense of identity and its perception, whether you want to argue or debate it or not, of feeling oppressed, um, related to what we now would call the Allied forces related to France, Britain, and the United States, and those other allies. And Japan was also dealing with the emergent power of the United States, as was Italy after coming off its series of wars, which I'll touch on briefly. And I think this also signifies what we were dealing with is kind of a realignment of power. We're facing a similar realignment now with the emergence of BRICS in terms of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So there's yet another way in which we're seeing tectonic plates and maybe even the development of another currency to challenge the US dollar in order to kind of reconfigure what plays out in the world. This is the stage, this is the opening moves, we could say, of a giant chess game that's happening with Uranus and Taurus. But kind of true to form, meaning going with the idea that Uranus in Taurus is more of a receptive sign, an earth sign, and going more toward an assertive air sign, we could say that Uranus in Gemini becomes a point where more things come out in the open rather than just dealing with the tectonic plate shifts. This is when we could be dealing more with the earthquakes and the opening up of particular things that have been more before subtle. So we know that the official crossing in this century of Uranus into Gemini commences July 7th, 2025. And then the last day that we have it before Uranus goes into Cancer is May 22nd, 2033. This is the chart for it. It is set for Washington, D.C. Let me say something about that before anyone comes for me. It's because I'm dealing with my nation's capital. You can do this for your nation's capital, or wherever that might be for you. But, you know, DC is America's capital, so I have set it for that, and it's for 3:47 and 16 seconds a.m. on July 7th, 2025. And what you can see that's interesting is Uranus is conjoined to Venus, directly opposite to the moon. And you might say, like, is something going to happen that day? I think I'm not going to say that nothing will not happen that day, so something could be, but I also don't want to be alarmist and say, like, okay, that day, just stay in your house, don't do it. It's less about that and more so about this particular time frame may be a catalyst related to some other things that have been brewing and surfacing for quite a while. And we're going to talk more about the transits of Uranus moving into Gemini and what that would signify. Oh, Rob is here, so I'm seeing some things in the chat. So I don't know if all the questions that are coming up. What I will say, because someone has asked me what software is this? This is Solar Fire. Now, one thing that's important, because what we are doing is talking about what we classically have called mundane astrology. Someone who's doing work similar to this, not so much with outer planets, but talking about world astrology, or mundane astrology, is Dr. Ali Alomi. And so he talks about this related to specifically as world astrology. And one of the things drawing on our predecessors, and more specifically, Islamic astrologers from, some would say, the Middle Ages, but even before, we can draw on looking at the great conjunctions. And specifically, when we're talking about the great conjunctions, we're talking about those between Jupiter and Saturn. And so what frames, and you're like, well, why are you talking about this? Who cares? You know, we're talking about Uranus and Gemini. But at the bedrock of a new moment in history are those conjunctions, and especially when they're in a new element. Now, we did have in 1980 and 1981, we did have what I call, and some have called, the Great Mutation, when Jupiter and Saturn were both in air. But for 240 years before that, and then at least 20 years after that, we had the great conjunctions in Earth signs. And so what we did have is a commencement, December 21st, 2020, of a longer cycle of at least 240 years, 220 years, we might even say, of Jupiter and Saturn being in air signs. And what you'll notice that is fascinating, again, it's set for Washington, D.C., so it will be different per your location in your country, because world astrology does work with what is the capital or the seat of government for a particular municipality or country, as we define it now. That you'll see that Taurus is rising in that particular chart. And then it is going with a square to the Jupiter and Saturn. Let me make sure I get like an annotator so you can follow what I'm saying. You have Jupiter and Saturn square to your ascendant and Uranus. And again, this is a commencement related to air. And this was even more classically important in terms of that great conjunction than how we talk about things related to the age of Aquarius, what we call the great ages. There's more of an immediacy. And the great ages will talk about what is the tone, the nature of governments during this particular time frame. As you can see, this Uranus comes into alignment to the Jupiter and Saturn through a trine. And by virtue of that, there's more of, we could say, a flow, a certain kind of ascent, not ascent, but more so, more an alignment, we can say, and furthering the dimensions and understanding of this age of air. And air, I'll just say for now, a lot of people relate this to technology and will say that it relates to how we understand technology and communication. I'm more inclined to say two things related to that, especially coming from Uranus and Taurus, that it's going to be more in alignment related to, yes, relatability, how we communicate, how we connect, all these things tie into technology. But coming from this age of air, age of earth into this age of air, it's also going to be about resources. It's going to be about how we are attentive or have been inattentive to how we've dealt with things from the earth, from labor, from work, and in relation to building, advancing technology. So as an example, it's one thing to talk about AI and be all juiced up about AI. It's another thing to talk about, well, where's the water coming from? Where's the resources, and the metals, the precious metals, and other things that are going into this construction of AI? And that's where I think when I was talking about those tectonic shifts, things kind of happening beneath the surface, this is where, I'll just say it this way, and I probably will use this phrase a couple times during this lecture. This is where more fit can hit the shan, in terms of how we are relating. And it's, like I said, interesting that Earth was rising, in the chart for the entry point of the Great Conjunction, December 21st, 2020. And you might say, well, it's air rising for that Uranus and Gemini chart. It sure is, but we're also going to be dealing with other things by virtue of the fact that we have Jupiter and the Sun in Cancer. It's like this, almost like an exact opposition. So there is a setup for some showdowns. Now, before anyone goes into an alarmist phase, I am going to talk about some particular things related to that. But showdowns don't necessarily have to be complete, full-on dangerous conflicts, but I would be remiss if I didn't talk about particular things. So let's go back. 19th century, June 1858 to March 1866. When Uranus goes into Gemini, we have several things happening that I will compile with the two times I'm going to talk about Uranus's sojourn into Gemini, just in these 2 centuries, and then going into the 3rd century with us. In the U.S., it was a contestation of the expansion of slavery in the Western territories, which becomes the entry point, what becomes the U.S. Civil War. We also have the introduction of the transatlantic telegraph cable. We have the gold rush that commences during the Uranus's sojourn into Gemini. The first transcontinental mail service happens while Uranus is in Gemini, first rechargeable battery. There have been a series of wars in Italy that ultimately lead during this time frame to unification. Because I think we tend to forget that, we think of Italy as always just Italy, and it definitely hasn't been, whether we're talking about from the Middle Ages or before until even the 19th century. We have the authorization of the U.S. Transcontinental Railroad. Then we have the introduction of the International Red Cross. I just want you to note and look, even though these are just some highlighted points over the 7 years, what seems like almost 8 years, but really almost 7, some change. What kinds of things happen? We have some things and ways in which things come apart, and then some things that come together, and then we have this other word, trans, that seems to come up related to that. There's a lot more events that seem to happen in the 20th century when Uranus was in Gemini from August 1941 to June 1949. We have World War II is in full swing. Now, everyone who's kind of studied history will know that, yes, the U.S.'s entry was in December of 1941, but it was a war before that. The world was still at war in that sense. But it was in full swing along with the commencement, which on the books was in 1941 of the Jewish Holocaust and the commencement of those extermination campaigns and camps. Interesting. I found this interesting. I don't know if anyone else finds this interesting. It was the coining during this time of the word teenager, which I think is very apt for Uranus and Gemini. Blimps make the first transatlantic crossing. We have ENIAC, the developments in computing and cryptography. A lot of these, I just want to point out, a lot of these came from war and some of the developments during the war. Le Monde, the French newspaper, emerges. We have in earnest with the development of the atomic weapon, the atomic bomb, the beginning of the atomic age. Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered during this time, which kind of corroborated some aspects of the Bible and then led others to question other dimensions of it, mainly the Old Testament. We have the Greek Civil War, almost as companion to the U.S. Civil War from before. We have India-Pakistan independence, but we also at the same time, during this block of time, will have its separation. East-West Germany, that should be a Germany, so excuse that. NATO, we have the development of NATO, but we also have the Soviet bloc that emerges. The UN during this time partitions Palestine, which leads to the creation of the nation state we call Israel. Sound and racial barriers are broken. What I mean by that, literally the sound barrier was broken the first time, and then we also have someone like Jackie Robinson who participates in the first, I guess, national team, baseball team. We have the official Declaration of Human Rights along with the emergence of what we now call the UN, United Nations. I find this interesting. The term Big Bang was coined during this particular time, and the modem was invented, which becomes the precedent for what we know as the internet, and which becomes, this particular thing that we now call and we're taking advantage of as the World Wide Web. Now, let's talk about some crossover lessons that we can learn from the 19th and 20th centuries. I've been saying this for a while, and I'm not the only one. I know the astrologer Nick Dagan Best has also been saying this. There are raised hands, but please put your questions in the chat and then we can determine whether or not, and this is for clarification, we can determine whether I can answer them now or it's best to answer them at the end, because I don't want to do a whole bunch of interruptions just yet. So Callum and Misty, if you could just monitor that for me. What Nick and I have been saying is the U.S. has not been at war with this transit. You're like, well, why are you just focused on the U.S.? I mean, it's where I do live, but it also is fascinating because I can't say that's been true for every country, but when it was true in the 18th century. The US was at war. It's also been true in the 19th century and the 20th century. Now, you might say, well, then we're just going to be at war. Well, I hope not. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention that particular observation. There's increased micronization of technology, especially for computing needs. That's a prediction I'm making based on what we've seen with Uranus in Gemini in the sign of Mercury before, which is kind of more steady advances related to technology that comes in basically erasing, blurring, challenging distance lines and lanes. So you notice that the word, as I mentioned, just the next line, trans becomes an issue. And I think this is all dimensions of what we can talk about as trans, whether we're talking about transcontinental, transdental, transpersonage, all these particular ways in which we're talking about this. This may become more of a focus and set of possibilities as we merge or emerge or move into Uranus and Gemini. I think it may come with a new age of technological development, especially related to one of the three comms, maybe even all three comms that I associate with Mercury. The three comms with Mercury are commuting, communication, and commerce. These things all kind of become highlighted when we're talking about mercurial things. We also can observe that nations split apart and others come together, maybe even the same nations, because as much as we talked about this, the Civil War, the US Civil War, it also kind of brought the nation together eventually at the end of the Civil War, while Uranus was in Gemini. Then the other thing, because you notice that I talked about commerce and currency, there's a fine line between growth and greed because as I mentioned, there was a gold rush. And so this could also be when we're dealing with another emerging interest in, lack of a better way to put it, getting wealthy fast. This might be what we're seeing related to people's excitement with cryptocurrency and even the next thing that emerges with it. So let's talk about Uranus moving through the decans and what that might signify as understanding particular things that we can glean from Uranus's sojourn over the 7 years. First, let me break down, if you're not familiar with the concept of decans being seen a particular way. Decans divides a particular sign into 10 degrees. Now, just to be clear, because it's on the nature of it being ordinal, talking about from 0 degrees to 9 degrees and 59 minutes, rather than just, oh, stop at 10. Then we keep going all the way through, because the 30th degree is always like the 29 degrees and 59 minutes. So that's kind of more so to understand these particular blocks of time. Using the traditional Western notion of it, which is not the same as what we get from India or what we understand based on triplicity of the decans. The decans for Gemini will be with Jupiter, then Mars, and then the Sun. Now, you may have learned it a different way, and that's okay. So some of you may have learned it as Mercury, and then it would be for Venus, and then it would be Saturn. But this is the traditional way that we do it for that. Okay. Let's move forward. Let's talk about Decan 1. First off, you'll see that this is drawing on the tarot, and it's a very nice visual way to deal with the idea of these decans and some measure of the Western tarot, especially if you're familiar with the Rider-Waite deck. I am using the Thoth deck from Aleister Crowley. That will highlight more so particular ways which we can understand each of those planets. Now, Gemini itself relates to the Lover's card in the major arcana. And so what you're seeing here is the idea of the duality. And then we have, in terms of the like in terms of race, that dimension of it. We have the club, and we also have the roses. And again, I'm using the Crowley deck. Um, and we have the Orphic egg with the serpent. And so we have all these different mystical images that I really like in looking at the Crowley deck. With the Wheel of Fortune, that is a card that is mostly aligned consistently with Jupiter. And so, as you can see and remember, Jupiter is part of the first decan. And then we have here the card that is related to it is the Lord. And we start with, by the way, with the Eight of Swords. And you're like, well, why are we using swords? Because swords relates to air as the the part of the deck that will deal with air itself. And so 8, 9, and 10, those particular cards are what's going to be highlighted as each of the decans related to Gemini. So one of the things to understand, and by the way, in both the Crowley deck and also the Rider-Waite deck, this is called the Lord of Interference. And you're like, well, why is that significant, in terms of dealing with Uranus's entry into Gemini, which will color it for the next 10 degrees. That's because as we actually have the turning of the wheel, and I think Crowley describes it here for his own deck. He says the number 8 pod. One other thing that I'm not going to get into because I know we won't have time is that each of the numbers relate to a Sephiro in the Kabbalah, in the tree of life. So this is related to the 8th Sephira, which is Hod, signifies a lack of persistence in matters of the intellect and contest. Good fortune, however, attends good fortune, looking at the Wheel of Fortune, attends even these weakened efforts thanks to the influence of Jupiter in Gemini, ruling the decan. Yet the will is constantly thwarted by accidental interference. What this might seem like, and I give an analogy down here where I say a full shopping cart in a superstore with dwindling time, meaning that you have so many different options and so many things that you kind of want to put in there and have happen that it's almost to the point where there's some measure of overwhelm. Interference is kind of this cacophony, more noise. Along with that, this is where in T.S. Chang's excellent book, T.S. Chang's book, The 36 Secrets, she says that she challenges this idea that, we might feel a rush toward having more control because we're overwhelmed, when you suddenly have like a surplus of a lot of different things. You feel like, oh, then I just need to just have order. And this can also induce anxiety. Well, the remedy for anxiety is not more control. And that is a hard pill to swallow for anyone. Because it's like, well, who says? But in essence, it is still, especially as we're talking about the first decan, which we will experience from July 25 to May 2028. This may be among the bigger themes that we're dealing with over those 3 years or near 3 years. Understand this is a wide span of time. So as much as I'm saying that, it's going to have dimensions of that rather than that it will be set a particular way. Continue. Let's go to decan 2. So as part of their major arcana, we do have the Tower, which is symbolizing more Mars, which is the second decan. And then we have the 9 of Swords, which becomes more symbolic to the second decan, which is called the Lord of Cruelty. Now, it's like, oh, is everything just going to get more cruel? And people, well, no, it's kind of more expressing this level of where we might, having come from dealing with this overwhelm with so many different options or the blitzkrieg of so many different actions, we kind of start to talk about things with some measure of despair. concern, and Austin Coppock's book, 36 Faces, which we've been expecting a reprint of that book for some years, so we hope it does come back out. But if you're lucky to have one, what he says in it is it depicts the moments of despair which occur within this face, the irreconcilable places, where things seem to clash after dealing with that surplus. And there's, again, the cacophony seems to kind of have more of an emotional effect. If I were to give another designation or a way of describing this, it would be like buyer's remorse that prompts you to want to talk to the manager. More ways in which after you've made your choices, like you put everything in your cart, you're like, well, and you take it home and like, I really didn't need 2 of these. And then you think about more so ways in which you want to negotiate and to have something else happen. But it makes me think of a line from Rudyard Kipling's If, where he says, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those 2 imposters just the same, recognizing that they're all of one piece. And that is actually a recurring theme that we can experience with Gemini in general, and Uranus moving into Gemini as kind of this duality of, these different things that are happening and moving and shaking and challenging us emotionally. One thing I'm thinking about, if you kind of want to get some measure of a preview of what to expect with this second decan, look no further than what's happening right now with Jupiter and Gemini at 11 degrees, or the 12th degree of Gemini having just gone direct. In my country, right now, there is a lot of this happening. There are some people who are also literally dealing with buyer's remorse. I voted for who? I didn't vote for who? What happened? What is going on? This is some measure of it. And what I would say is the counterbalance, rather than kind of giving into the fear, is to get to a point of equanimity when I talk about treating triumph and disaster as 2 imposters just the same. There is a way in which you kind of have to step more into, I would say, a balance. I don't like to say detachment as much as non-attachment, and recognizing that, there is, in this aspect of cruelty, it's recognizing that the most cruel thing one can do is to be cruel to oneself, because when you start becoming cruel to yourself, it becomes near impossible to be as kind to others. So kindness, equanimity, maintaining some measure of balance becomes critical as we're dealing with this particular decan. Again, if you want to get some measure of a foretaste of it, look no farther than what you're dealing with in terms of this particular moment in history with Jupiter. Then the final decan, decan 3, again, we're dealing with the lovers, but we're dealing also with the sun and then the Lord of Ruin. Now, why the sun is interesting is that the last decan, as we talk about it through the solar year, is the last 10 days of Gemini just before we go to Cancer. And when I say the end of an era or a season, it does recognize the fact that the classic, as influenced by Egypt, the classic New Year would begin with Cancer. We would talk about it, or we talk about it astrologically as Aries, but if we use something called the Thema Mundi, which is the story of the world or story of the creation of the world, it actually commences with Cancer. And so we could be talking about, the end of an era. Now, let me give you a timeout. Something that's not in my bio. I am a former Christian minister. Operative word is former. And I used to preach, in terms of the apocalypse and the end of the world. Why I'm mentioning this, I do not believe in the end of the world, nor am I talking about it right now. I just want to make that emphatically clear. So no one's thinking like, well, Sam Reynolds said that, it's the end of an era, the world might be ending. It's not. I mean, we've been through this before. This is why I mentioned the 19th and 20th centuries. So it's not like the first time that we've had Uranus and Gemini in the final decan. But one thing we can recognize, especially looking back, is that it was the world changed. Um, that's not contestable. And so I like to go back to the origin of the word apocalypse, which is more an unveiling. We kind of start seeing things with clearer sight. So even though this seems like a scary card, ruin, it is more so dealing with an opening, more so with things kind of, um, I guess, yeah, that we can see clearly. And this is why I love this quote from 36 Secrets by Susan Chang, where she says, one of the things, and I think this is kind of funny, where we kind of have to have some measure of humor during this particular deck in this particular moment, is that it seemed like a good idea at the time. And so a lot of things that may have seemed like a good idea at the time, um, even that we embraced, just weren't. What's also interesting is that, according to one of the myths that inform how we talk about Geminis, we are dealing with the idea of Castor and Pollux. And one particular twin was immortal, Pollux, and the other one was very human, Castor. So Castor um, lost his life, and his brother was crestfallen and sorely depressed by it, and pleads to the gods for a solution, and they find one by them both having taken turns between Olympus and Hades and sharing Pollux's immortality and having his brother resume his life again, having Castor come back to life. And so what we may find during this particular decan with Uranus and Gemini is the resurfacing, I won't say of a compromise, but of a solution, the unveiling of something that allows us to be able to see um, real possibilities. Um, rather than the way we thought ideally things should be, we start to see more how things can be. We go into the light of the sun, perhaps after some measure of ruin. And again, we don't have to go to the severity like, oh, are we gonna all be crawling out of, rubble? No, not necessarily. I think more so what we can be talking about is dealing with, some measure of seeing things that were not there or not clearly. Again, it doesn't have to be broad scale destruction, nor will I say that there'll be no destruction or anything like that, but it may be talking about in terms of what has happened before. If it's, if precedent becomes presaging for what could happen, it definitely could lead more to, some difficult changes. But one thing that is important for us to remember during this time, and this is a quote from my friend Laura Marie Thompson that I've loved, and she's just a personal friend. I don't think she's written anything down that anyone can find, but she once said to me, we're at a party, and I don't remember exactly what we were talking about completely, but I know I was talking about some measure of someone doing something shady or just reprehensible, and she said, humans want to be right more than they want to be loved. And that stayed with me over the last 20 years or so. Um, in terms of that. Someone is asking me, death of a twin. I literally mean Castor and Pollux. I am not talking about, the death of a Gemini. Um, I'm talking about related to the myth and the sacrifice, and more so of the bartering between the two of them in terms of sharing immortality rather than just being consumed by one particular vision. It's kind of rectifying the duality. Yeah. Thank you, Wendy. So let's move on. So these are more related to the decans. So now I want to talk about generations. And this is again an idea that I came upon I think it was like 2002, but I started talking about it in 2003. And it's a quote from Frantz Fanon, who was a revolutionary Algerian writer and psychologist. He said, Each generation out of relative obscurity must discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. And what that signifies for me is we're looking at missions and themes for multiple generations. In previous talks, I've considered all the way from Uranus in Cancer to Uranus in Capricorn. Today, in the interest of time, I'm only going to be talking about Uranus in Scorpio to Capricorn. Each generation is measured, just so you understand, the space between reproductive cycles of parents to children, that's about 35 years. Why 35 years and why Uranus? Because Uranus has transit through a sign of 7 years. And so we are talking about some unit of 5. So 7 times 5 is 35. Astrologically, this is measured as a quincunx, or a difference of 5 signs between one transit at birth and another. What is a quincunx? It is the coming of age aspect at 150 degrees. I think it's comparable to the gibbous phase, which is actually defined at 135 degrees if we're talking about the gibbous phase of the moon. You can think of it as being preparatory, like being backstage or being called to places. It is the nature of an apprenticeship, where you are studying and being prepared for something. A longing, we could say, quincunx is also a longing that might feel even palpable. People also talk about it as where we have a level of adjustment or need for adjustment. The other way I can think about it is a quote from Shakespeare's Hamlet: "The readiness is all." But why talk about it in relation to the gibbous phase, I imagine, is a natural question. Why not the opposition? The Uranus opposition usually precipitates a personal crisis to confront and experience. We're in like a full moon. It's on like Donkey Kong. You really have to deal with the circumstances as they're presented to you. It's like, the gibbous phase is just before the full moon that readies you. This is the same kind of thing. It's an initiation. The other way I describe it, it's an activation, a chance to show the world what's embedded within you without the full pressure just yet, meaning that would come at the Uranus opposition. It works in tandem with the Saturn square, with the oldest of a Uranus generation at 35 years old. The youngest will be at their Saturn returns. But this is a lot more subtle in some sense. Let me pause for a second, see what's in the chat. There is a type of adjustment that uses the word usually with it, but I think there's a little more exacting terms that we can start to use with that. Okay. So for those born or know those who are born with Uranus in Scorpio, I define this as through a glass darkly. And let's review what happened with Uranus in Scorpio. It was actually happening between November 1974 to November 1981. In the United States, we were dealing with the fallout from Watergate. We had the 3 Mile incident and general fear of nuclear power. We also were dealing with the ending of the Vietnam War, the death of Elvis. What's interesting is that toward the end of this time, we have the emergence of Microsoft and Apple. We also, during this time, have the premiere of Roots, Jaws, and Star Wars, very big films, discovery of Chiron, explosion of disco with Saturday Night Live, incredible blizzards, the Shah of Iran falls to the Ayatollah Khomeini, and we have also the emergence of video games. Some themes that we might highlight here is that we're talking about dimensions of power, and we might also say, this is just on the cusp of the AIDS pandemic, as something also kind of happening, and this generation is kind of processing with a certain loss of faith in the general workings of power. Well, the activation for them by quincunx, Uranus moving into Aries, another Mars sign, is going to be it was May 2010 to May 2018. And so when I say winter is coming there, bared fangs and essentials, this became the preoccupation and the activation for the Uranus and Scorpio generation. So we were dealing with a world financial austerity or a crisis during the recession. peak oil concerns. We had Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, populist risings of extremes. We had Bernie on one end, Trump on the other, Black Lives Matter, a spike in gun violence in the US, heightening tensions with Russia. So what I mean by this activation is that you start to see some ways in which there's a surfacing, a readying for a particular generation to deal with the seeded topics of their era, Uranus and Scorpio in this case, and what will happen as they are when Uranus moves into Aries in terms of their particular developments. Another example we can go into is Uranus in Sagittarius, just to get the rhythm, because Uranus in Gemini, just to skip ahead for a second, is the activation for Uranus in Capricorn. So those with Uranus in Capricorn, this is when it's going to be their time or call to places. Edge of tomorrow is how I might define this particular generation. Yeah, I'm kind of, I see where some of you are kind of like trying to wrap your head around, a different calling for quincunxes. So I'm just gonna go and just say some things. It is an irritation, but think also, oh, you can't hear me? Callum, how's my sound?
I can hear you fine. I think you're okay.
Yeah, some seem to think I'm going softer, which I'm like, me?
Doesn't sound
Thank you,
like
Rhonda. So I don't know what's going on tonight. And so Jolie is kind of weighing in and saying, I've always thought of quincunx. I think others have said a similar thing, as an irritation that you can't directly source or accurately articulate. I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm saying something a little deeper, especially in a broader level. It's literally before you are on stage or you're dealing with something forthright directly, like the opposition. It is where you feel a stirring. And that can be like, yeah, something in your shoe or some other kind of thing that you can't quite pin down. But this also has a lot more force. We also can think about the quincunx by its actual degree related to 135 degrees as we're talking about the gibbous. And so it's this readying. So it does include that as well. And what makes you ready? What prompts you to kind of do things? Anxiety, some distress that is hard to name or pin down, some particular catalytic event that you didn't know was as big at the time, but it does, as you reflect on it, especially at the full moon, you come to understand. So this is what's happening with this particular, for each generation. Okay. So Uranus in Sagittarius, February 1981 to 1988. What we have is shattering of traditional controls of communication and knowledge. Again, this is large in the US, but I'm sure it was happening in some permutation. So, for instance, a lot of people, now that we have cell phones, don't know that you used to have to, when you move, you either purchased your phone or you would have to hand in your phone to Bell Atlantic because they effectively owned your phone. But we have all these different things that start to crop up during this time, MTV, CNN, then the early advent of cell phones, video games go mainstream rather than just, just a few kind of have video arcades. And then we also have personal computing becomes more iconic. In fact, it becomes more the prelude to what we know or come to know as the World Wide Web. One thing some people may not realize, especially if they're younger, the internet existed before the World Wide Web. I was on the internet during this time. It wasn't the World Wide Web, but we had listservs, we had other things that we would access. And so, yeah, it was all about kind of bringing on the modem. Now, notice what I said, getting a modem, getting hooked up. Like, oh, wasn't that something that came up in Uranus and Gemini? Yes, the full moon. So this was kind of more the just another moment of its maturation of that technology. It was the pinnacle of Cold War fears. pop, rock, and rap dominate the airwaves. And that was a big thing because everyone had their own lines and lanes. Um, you know, especially I grew up in Buffalo, and in Buffalo we have radio station WBLK. So everyone in my family, everyone I knew who was black, we all listened to WBLK. But with MTV and the advent of, some crossover songs, this became more of a thing. It's interesting that this happens at the opposition with Sagittarius, but this is what the Uranus and Sagittarius generation was dealing with. We also have We Are the World, that song, but also the idea of making a multicultural world. Crack sweeps the US, the rise of AIDS. Um, we have the advent of the Terminator films, which echoes Frankenstein, which was true from the last time Uranus was in Sagittarius. And then we have Gorbachev's Glasnost, which presages the end of the Soviet Empire or Union. And we have the end of the Iran-Iraqi wars or war. The activation point for this generation was when Uranus moved into Taurus, which has not ended yet. So this is why you might remember with that slide earlier, I said we have the redrawing of global divisions. This is where you almost could say that Uranus and Taurus is the challenge for the Uranus and Sagittarius generation to maintain a belief in a world, rather in globalism, and more so how we can traverse boundaries. But you would see now, at this particular moment, this generation is challenged with like, well, we're just going to erase that aspect of history. We're going to change this notion of history. We don't have to, especially in my country, we don't have to emphasize diversity as much anymore. And we should get rid of DEI and all these particular things that we were concerned about as Uranus was in Sagittarius, and that generation has been trying to articulate. So I hope you're starting to grasp what I'm saying, also about what's happening with each generation and each generation's mission. So that brings us to Uranus in Capricorn, which I will define as coming out of the wilderness. And what marks this particular generation, December 1988 to January 1996, is that we have the emergence at this time, the growth of captains of industry, which also was true the last time, 83, 84 years ago, from that time when Uranus was in Capricorn. The emergence of some of the big ticket items that, especially related to technology. This time it was more computing and more like Microsoft and other things. Last time it was more in terms of transportation, other Gemini, mercurial things. Major political tectonic shifts, including the fall of the Soviet Empire, is what emerged the last time, when Uranus was in Capricorn. Worldwide Web emerges. Wildness, the idea of wildness made civilized, like the Tarzan narrative. Now, if you guys grew up with the Tarzan movie, that comes a little later, but the beginnings of it, I believe, start, in terms of the making of the film, 1995. And this becomes a reworking of major trade agreements like NAFTA that happened during the Clinton administration. Now, as Uranus goes into Gemini, this is where you start to see the challenge to all these particular points. But more specifically, where's my cursor? Okay. Okay. Oops, went too fast. More specifically, it becomes a defining point of how I might say these are the particular challenges that this generation may face, especially related to not so much about how we build the world as Uranus and Sagittarius, but I would say more so how we maintain or even rebuild after some measure of these shifts and divisions that have happened, which is, understanding when Uranus moves into Gemini, it's their activation point that they'll commence and keep developing as Uranus moves into Cancer. So one thing to understand what I'm saying is that Uranus in Cancer ties to the Uranus in Sagittarius. So the advent of, like, what made Uranus in Sagittarius was what was commenced, or we could say the seed in Uranus in Cancer. What flowers with the Uranus in Capricorn was seeded with the Uranus in Leo, because that was their activation point. So what I'm saying is that the maturation of another generation at its activation is a raw fodder for the generation that seeded that or was born at another time. So there's ways in which we kind of are always in movement in kind of developing another generation that gets activated at another time. So the Uranus in Capricorn generation is seeding the Uranus in Gemini generation, those who will be born while is in Gemini. And then that generation will activate again, you know, 5 signs later related to what will happen. So Uranus in Gemini, we're talking about Uranus in Scorpio. So Uranus in Gemini will seed the Uranus in Scorpio generation that will happen 35 years later. For instance, the issues of power that manifest at Uranus and Capricorn are seeded by all previous generations, but acutely developed and felt by the Uranus and Leo generation. There's always a dynamic of opposite by gender, which we could say assertive to receptive, masculine to feminine, a way in which there's this development. So what does this mean for us? Your generation's mission isn't just its own. It's part of a temporal network that connects themes of power, energy, identity, resources, creativity, and understanding with others, whether directly your kin or not. This is why it's so important to think about how we kind of shape, not our generation, but just generations to come. A generation's work is never done, even when everyone's gone. The Prometheus-Uranus cycle remains, and circles back 83, 84 years. What can you do? What does this mean for you on a personal level? What to look for in your personal chart? Now, what I will highlight, and you can take a screenshot because I know I'm running low on time. There are some things to consider over the next 2 years, 2025 to 2026. Saturn sextile to Uranus. And, one thing I find fascinating, it's more the soft aspects that we see over the next 2 years, the sextiles and the trines, which I'll define a sextile as more as an awakening. I'm not one of those people who likes to talk about, there's going to be a dawn and a change in human consciousness. I don't know if I can go that far, but I will say that I do think there will be more related to Uranus as the challenger, as the firebrand, all these particular things. What we can see with Saturn, like sextile Uranus or Uranus sextile Pluto, Uranus sextile Neptune, is a reshaping of vision. One of the things to think back on, as Neptune was in Aries the last time, which was at the start of the U.S. Civil War in 1861, is that as much as I talked about war, there is also this need of a vision related to possibilities of a new world that drove people out west. It drove certain utopian movements. It was the beginning of thoughts related to communism and socialism as an answer or challenge to industrialization. It was also the advance and development of things related to science fiction. So specifically, being willing to entertain other possibilities in the world. So what I'm saying and seeing with all these different aspects that are transits that are happening is that on a challenging level, people may start to question and deal more with this social order in more vigorous ways, building more connections. And then on a more positive note, we may see some advances and introductions of new technologies that may open new vistas for us that I think will be exciting to see over the next 2 years. Well, okay, well, how do I deal with this personally? Well, a couple things. One, I would ask you to analyze, since Uranus symbolizes some of these things, one's individuality, creative freedom, where's that squelched right now? where you need to turn up and adjust the volume, since we were just talking about that related to my volume. How do we cultivate more or greater originality and authenticity in our lives? In terms of new structures that we can introduce, new ways of thinking. How can I use my Saturn? I'll explain why I'm saying Saturn in a minute, to find more natural limits, more suitable boundaries for me to thrive in. The counterpoint often to the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, to Pluto, is Saturn. Saturn will look at Uranus and be like, okay, yeah. So you're doing these new ideas, but how do you structure them? How do you put them in practice? You have these new dreams, Neptune, but how do we actually make sense of them and put them again into practice? Pluto, you've excavated and you have found different aspects of yourself. How do you start working through them systematically in some way that they make more sense for you? Localize. By Uranus, you can start looking at, where does Uranus fall in your natal chart? And what might be the relationship to it? If there were more time, I would go into each of the generations and how that might relate to the Uranus placement that you have, at least by sign. Then you can look at it by house. You might see, again, where is Gemini as it falls in your chart? If you are an Aries rising, it's going to be in your third house. How about that Uranus and Gemini move? Then you can look at its relationship to other planets as well in your chart. In general, I think it's important to look at some of these other factors, the first, fourth, seventh, 10th house, the angles, and how the transiting planet affects that, Uranus, and then how it relates to your natal. But there's one important point, again, you can take a screenshot of this because this is a reiteration of some of the things I've said, but I don't think this is said enough. We astrologers get very excited about planets moving into new signs. Like Uranus is going into Gemini, it's going to do this, 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 and this. Moving into my fourth house. I might move. I might do all these other things. But pay attention to the house it's left. Because, and this is true, I think, for all the outer planets. For Neptune, which is making a shift. For Pluto, that made a shift last year, and now is getting better situated. Because what it's highlighting and what that means are the lessons that you can process and learn, because that work now has been completed. So think about what Uranus in Taurus has meant for you, rather than just rushing like, well, what is Uranus in Gemini going to mean for me? This is where I would encourage you to think about the last 7 years, especially when he settles into Gemini. What did the last 7 years mean for you? What did you learn from them? How did you embrace them? What didn't you do? Where were you not true to your sense of authenticity in these particular things? Okay. Just 2 examples I want to say before we start to close out. I wanted to use Steve Jobs because Steve Jobs had Jupiter and Uranus in Cancer, so his activation was Uranus in Sagittarius, as I mentioned to you. And what did that mean? If you go back to Uranus in Sagittarius, you might remember I was talking about the advent of all these things related to technology and, what became more the internet and personal computing, all these things. And you're like, well, what's the personal lesson here? Well, Jupiter Uranus didn't necessarily manifest for Steve Jobs, as far as we've been able to document, as philanthropy, but it did come through in terms of innovation. Someone could have said, and this also is reiterated by his moon and his Mars, of course, and being a Virgo rising, but this generation, this Jupiter and Uranus, was from 1955 very much conditioned, we could say, by their activation for innovation. And we could also say, with it being in Cancer, the idea of personal computing. Having a computer, those of us who are a little older can remember the magic. I'm talking to you from a laptop, and the idea of having a computer in your home, considering that our understanding of computers were like whole rooms at the time, was magical. it seemed improbable. But the idea that Jupiter and Uranus, as manifested with his activation in Sagittarius, was kind of bringing it home. The other person I think about is Toni Morrison, who had a Uranus in Aries, and her activation, in terms of her generation's mission, came, during my birth time, which is Uranus in Virgo. So for her, it was more about the people who are on the margins, marginalia, those who activate. For her, it was personally related to the fifth house and more creativity. So as she was experiencing more of that Virgo light, this is where she commenced on her, or we're working on her short stories and going toward her book, which became the bluest. Her first book became The Bluest Eye, based on telling different stories, paving a different way, which was the nature of her Uranus in Aries. So in summary, just to kind of go things up, and then we're going to have some times for questions. The shifts of Uranus happens on the level of sign, decans, and aspects. So we talked about all three particular things. Uranus's movement through the signs by quincunx may tell us more about each generation's mission and how we may come to fulfill it or have fulfilled it. And Uranus's position in your chart provides clues about how to fit into your generation's mission and how that might mean something for you. So with that said, I am going to thank you. This is how you can find me. I see that something was in the chat. And let's see if I can handle some of the outstanding questions that you may have had. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Sam, for an excellent presentation. I could listen to you all day.
Oh, thank you, buddy. Thank you.
Just a wealth of knowledge, information. It's a privilege to work under you at Kepler College. I don't know if you can see all the hearts and the claps coming through.
I can see them. That's nice. Okay, thank you.
Wonderful. Very active chat. Thank you for all sharing your Uranus stories in the chat. Let's see what we've got in the Q&A. Quick one, because I think it's something that came up a few times. What orbs are you using generally with outer planets?
Orbs related to what, though?
I'm not sure. The question just says, what is the size of orb for the aspects? And I'm not quite sure what slide they're referring to.
Okay, so if they're talking about the transit slides here, they're tight. They're exact. So the only one that's not exact, but it's still within minutes, is the Uranus sextile to Pluto. So everything that you're seeing, they're exact, exact calculation. So I would say, and I think that's if we're talking about a broader question related to one's personal chart, I like to stick closer to 1 degree in terms of feeling it. I do take Rob Hand's, if anyone has planets in transit, he doesn't really believe in orbs. And I think there is some wisdom to it. Who am I to disagree with the great hand? But I would say there is some wisdom to it because, I mean, I think, I don't think there's a big secret, Callum. We talked about Pluto kind of going toward your sun. You may have felt that even before it's exact or within a degree. So there can be some dimensions of it. I mean, I have my moon at 2 degrees Leo. And so there's some measure of that kind of has surfaced beforehand. So I think we can use 1 degree just to be, 1 degree just to be tighter, but in general, in terms of experientially, you can think about how that might manifest or work with you.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm not sure this is a question, more of a comment. Just a comment on Uranus in Capricorn was also about opening up of business to foreign companies in the typically closed women's apparel industry at the time where I was before discovering astrology. I remember the factories from Asian countries and manufacturers from the EU coming into the garment center and shaking things up then. Interesting.
That actually is great. I mean, I wish, let me see, that's in there. I'm going to take a screenshot of that because I can incorporate that. Who made that? Who said that? Let me see here.
Oh, I'm sorry. I answered the question live. Let's see if I can go back to it.
Okay, I see it. I see it. It's
Oh, you see it?
Cheryl.
Okay.
It's my friend Cheryl. Okay. Thank you, Cheryl. Let me figure out how to do a print screen. Okay, there we go. Thank you. I'll be sure to cite you.
Wonderful. Any advice for Uranus in Capricorn conjunct Saturn and Neptune generation? If I've read that correctly.
So one thing I say about the Uranus and Capricorn generation, which I didn't mention, so I'm glad I have this opportunity. You guys are builders. You're going to rebuild. I've been saying that for these 23 years, and you're like, oh. So when you're rebuilding, these particular things, for the world, that means like rebuilding what? Something else has happened that requires more rebuilding, right? And so to have Saturn and Neptune means that you come with some measure of vision, you have some measure of ideas, you have some measure of ways in which you can see the possibilities. I might put it, Uranus and Sag brings the vision, but you guys bring the blueprint.
Well, I'm not sure about this question. Maybe we'll extend this question to, in your experience with Uranus on the angles, possibly, well, let's talk about natally. So ascendant, IC, MC, descendant. What are your experiences for people or clients that maybe you've seen through the years?
I think it's accurate to say that, that they, let me see the question just to kind of review it here. When it's at the angles, Uranus is going to show up. There's some way in which you kind of go against the normative. You can't help but shock. You can't help but surprise. You can't help but kind of in some way go off the beaten path to introduce something that is novel, creative, or I'll just say it, fucking weird. So
I love your no nonsense down approach to earth to answering questions. I love it. Let's see, this is going to be an interesting question for you because I know you've got thoughts on this, but they're asking about what about the Uranus and Capricorn in mutual reception with Saturn in Aquarius generation. Now, maybe that's a broader question to traditional rulerships versus modern. So I'll let you fly.
mutual reception for the Saturn Aquarius. Well, one, I'm having fun, so don't take me too seriously at this particular point. One, I'm like, what are you talking about? What does Uranus have to do with Aquarius? Um, so I do have to say, or have to say that. So I don't acknowledge modern rulers. It's not part of my thing at all. But um, I will say this, that Saturn in the Saturn in Aquarius generation that has the Uranus in Capricorn. When I say that Uranus and Capricorn generation are the builders, we could make a distinction between Saturn and Capricorn with Saturn in Aquarius. And I would say that the Saturn in Aquarius is going to be much more, conceptual, more thinking about things, especially related to, their Saturn returns that they enjoyed pretty much from 2020 to, Saturn went into Pisces. There's a maturation that's coming related to reworking ideas, not just the blueprint, but maybe even conceptualizing more broadly, particular ideas, particular terms, particular ways in which we can understand the movement of, ideologies or intellectual approaches. Whereas, maybe Saturn and Capricorn is kind of like, just tell me more what to do, or let me tell you what to do and roll up my sleeves and get to the work.
Wonderful. And if you care to share, there's a question here. It's a bit more personal, but what happened during your Uranus opposition? If you care to
Well,
share.
it's I talked more about the quincunx. So the activation for me was Uranus in Aquarius, right? For my generation, Uranus in for Uranus in Virgo. I'm a Uranus in Virgo, late Uranus in Virgo. So the activation with Uranus in Aquarius became me kind of working more with the World Wide Web and becoming a tech trainer. So for a time, I was helping to bridge the digital divide, and that was kind of my work for about 9 years, working in various communities to bridge the digital divide. So that's kind of more so what happened related to my Uranus quincunx, and then my Uranus opposition was the finishing of that and becoming more a full-time astrologer.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing. We've actually got someone here in the chat saying they're having a Uranus return in Gemini, asking if they're in for some interesting times.
Yes, you are. And you become really instrumental because you you may not remember exactly from the, when Uranus was in Gemini itself, but you can deal and talk about, experientially the aftermath of what happened with it. Um, because depending on when you were born during that Uranus cycle versus the end of it, if you're born more toward the beginning of it, which I'm going to go with the supposition you were at least 7 as Uranus goes into Cancer.
Fantastic. And maybe 2 more questions left because I know Sam have only got a few minutes left.
Yeah.
So, does the closing quincunx to natal Uranus have any relevance?
The closing quincunx from rather than the opening one. That's a good one. I haven't explored that. So I'm not going to say there isn't or isn't, but I haven't explored it related to that. When I do talk about the generations, and I have gone from Uranus in Cancer all the way to Uranus in Capricorn, I guess I would say, that ties in, but I haven't done that particular work. So that is something to explore. So thank you for that question.
Very interesting question. Excellent. Can you make a few comments about Uranus-Pluto conjunction in Virgo, folks, if you care?
Well, my emphasis is more so on Uranus itself. Uranus in Virgo, our particular generation, we were dealing with what I say, the little guy, people who functioned on the margins, whether we're talking about, because when we talk about civil rights, we weren't just talking about, in America, Black people. We were talking about Dalits in India. We're also talking about the awareness related to women. Also, while Uranus was in Virgo, we were talking about labor, and labor rights and unions and organizing related to Uranus and Virgo. We were talking about organic food. I was a baby. We were babies, but there was more of a growing awareness about how food was produced because, from the 40s and 50s, based on those new technologies, people were like, we could just freeze it and feed a lot more people and put junk in it and make it last longer. Well, I shouldn't say junk, preservatives to make it last longer. And that kind of started a whole movement, with Uranus and Virgo, which might have been, like I said, the Uranus and Aries generation kind of going like, why would I want to put that in my body? And so they started these co-ops and these smaller stores. Now, when my generation came of age, Uranus and Virgo came of age in Uranus in Aquarius, we're like, well, why do I have to go to this stinky co-op store all the time to go buy my organic produce? What if we had a bigger store? And someone's like, oh yeah, well, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. What if we call it Whole Foods, right? And so we have like a bigger store. And so we made organic products cool. We also made my generation also related to Uranus and Aquarius dealt with the work related to the World Wide Web. We didn't invent it, but we kind of mass produced it. We made it more popular, acceptable. The other thing I might say related to Pluto intensifies that. And so it was special to have the Uranus-Pluto moment together because I think that also became a catalyst for deeper aspects of change.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I agree with the statement here from Florencia. Hope I'm saying your name correctly. Thank you so much, Sam. Your eloquence and vibe are incredible to learn from. Very, very much agree. You. And last question we'll take for this evening. Let's see. Do you acknowledge the asteroids in conjunction with Uranus or disregard them, for instance, Lilith, etc.?
I don't like to use the word disregard. I don't have them incorporated in my practice. I do not have an active discrimination against the asteroids. I just don't generally include them. So that doesn't mean I wouldn't take that from someone else. That's just not my aspect of expertise. So if someone else had done that work, I would respect it, but no, I haven't done it myself.
Well, again, Sam, thank you so much for a brilliant presentation. And to reiterate for everybody, we'll have the replay up on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days.
Thank you.
It is my birthday weekend, so I'm going to go for a cheeky pie, but I always get my work done first. So I'll work on the video first, and then I can go and enjoy myself.
Well, let's say it. Happy birthday, Callum.
Thank you very much.
Happy
Thank you very much.
birthday.
Enjoy your day, all day.
Fantastic. If you've not been to our YouTube channel before, if you just go into YouTube and stick in KeplerCollege, you should be able to find it there. We'll have the replay, and then you can take screenshots and all those kind of things. I don't know. I think we had a question to about slides, Sam, and I wasn't sure.
Oh,
but
they want slides. I can send them to you.
Possibly, yeah. Or like say, you can catch the replay.
Send them as a PDF. Is that the better way to do it?
I think so. Yeah, I think that's what Laurie's been doing recently with the PDF. So
okay, give me a little bit, and probably it'll be tomorrow.
Okay.
Yeah. So
wonderful. Again, Sam, thank you so much. And of course, Sam teaches in 101, and I'm privileged to be there as a TA with Sam. So if you want to join us in our fundamentals for the next semester, and thank you for all the birthday well wishes, and we love our worldwide community. So thank you for zooming in from all over the world, especially if you're in, those places where you're up early, 5 or 6.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely wonderful.
And well, thank you, Misty. Thank you, Misty.
Thank you, Misty, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. It was a pleasure hanging out with everyone in the chat box.
Wonderful. See you next time. See everybody.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.